Welcome to Make It To The Dogears. I'm going to read 25 minutes of random pages on the Sunday morning, 11/7. Let's get into some interesting stuff. This one is from, it says the year. It must be by the Founding Fathers. Let's see, start with this side. Moment of creativity that has turned out to be the most brilliant improvisation of all. In that sense, though Adams had been proven right at each stage of the year-long march toward independence, he was proven wrong by the final chapter. For the draft of the Declaration of Independence, sent out to the world on July 4th, 1776, assured that the war for independence would be more than just that. If only lately and surreptitiously, it deserved to be called the American Revolution. Chapter 2, The Winter. Looking back at the moment of triumph in 1783, no less an authority than George Washington observed that the American victory in the war for independence defied all logic, indeed was quite likely to defy the capacities of future historians to explain it at all. If historiographers should be hard enough to fill the pages of history with the advantages that have been gained with unequal numbers on the part of America in the course of this contest, and attempt to relate the distressing circumstances under which they have been obtained, it is more than probable that posterity will bestow on their labors the epithet and marks of fiction, for it will not be believed that such a force as Great Britain has employed for 8 years in country could be baffled in their plan of subjugating it by numbers infinitely less, composed of men oftentimes half starved, always in rags without pay, and experiencing times every species of distress which human nature is capable of undergoing. Washington's endorsement of the war's successful outcome as a highly improbable and almost incredulous achievement was rooted in the assumption that it was primarily a contest between two armies. And from that perspective, incredulity is wholly justified, since the British Army was unquestionably the most proficient fighting force in the world, as the French discovered to their shock and horror. This one is about, it says, the third culture. Let's try this one. Niles Eldridge, Battle of Words. Statement of punctuated equilibria remove the old convenient element of directionality for long-term trends in the fossil record. But if you can see that there's a directionality over time, what is the explanation? What we're saying is that species are entities. They have histories, they have origins, they have terminations, and they may or may not give rise to descendant species. They're individuals in the sense that human beings are individuals, but a very different kind of individuals. They're large-scale systems that have an element of reality to them, and that's a big departure in evolutionary biology. There are some adumbrations of it, but certainly it's not traditional. Our notion of something that's called species selection or species sorting, a better term, sees the differential origins and extinctions of species as an important additional element shaping the history of life, including the production of long-term evolutionary trends. Species are real entities, spatio-temporally bounded, and information entities. Other kinds of entities do things. Ecological populations, for example, have niches. They function. Species don't function that way. They don't do things. They are instead information repositories. A species is not like an organism at all, but it's nonetheless a kind of entity that plays an important role in the evolutionary process. This is an ontological shift. Geneticists remain underwhelmed with the notion that species are real entities simply because they think their data, generation by generation change within populations, don't demand it. So John Maynard Smith, whom I respect a great deal, won't respond to the gambit that species are real entities with actual roles to play in the evolutionary process simply because he doesn't personally find it interesting. Richard Dawkins is trying to force everything into a genic explanation. It's ships passing in the night. You don't need that kind of concept at all if you're just dealing with generation by generation, running the natural selection algorithm. I don't blame those who don't find this interesting. It's our job to make them understand that construing species in this way adds a valid and interesting element to evolutionary theory. I call people like Steve and myself the naturalists, in contrast with our gene-minded colleagues, the ultra-Darwinians. We try to capture the middle ground. The three main characters in the ultra-Darwinian camp would be Maynard Smith, George Williams, and Richard Dawkins. All of us agree on the rudiments of evolutionary change, adaptive modification through natural selection. The one gloss on it the ultra Darwinians have developed is that the fundamental dynamic underlying all of biotic nature is a competitive urge to leave copies of your genes behind. Making bits of information, genes, compete with one another makes evolutionary biology seem more like physics, so my accusing ultra Darwinians of physics envy is probably the snottiest thing I could say about them. Punctuated equilibria reasserts the importance of discontinuity in evolutionary discourse, though it's usually the ultra Darwinians who are casting the role of defentress fidei. It's actually Mayer and Dozdansky, as founders of the modern synthesis, who originally managed to inject an element of discontinuity into the evolutionary discourse. It was actually we naturalists who were defending a corner of orthodoxy here. As Dobansky said, Darwin established the validity of natural selection. Natural selection generates a spectrum of continuous variation, but nature is discontinuous. It's discontinuous, as Dobansky said in 1937, at the gene level and again at the species level. Most evolutionary biologists are population geneticists, and so they don't, as I just said, see the significance of interspecific discontinuity. The data they handle aren't at the interspecies level. They're not used to thinking about these problems, so a lot of that early discourse, hard fought and hard won, about the differences between species defined as separate reproductive communities, doesn't enter into their universe. That's okay in a sense because what the hell, you talk about the stuff that impinges on your consciousness and what your data are all about. There's a lot to be said about the forces affecting the frequencies of genes on a generation by generation level within populations. But to restrict the discourse to species is to ignore other elements of biological organization, and ultra Darwinians do so at their peril. Theirs is an incomplete description of biotic nature, rendering the theory simplistic and incomplete. It's disturbing that in his recent book Natural Selection, George Williams goes out of his way to stress that species are no special category of biological entity. Ultra Darwinians generally deny that they're genetic reductionists, but by anyone's definition they absolutely are. They try to explain the structure and history of large scale systems purely in terms of relative gene frequencies. That was from the third culture. It's a lot on species populations, stuff like that, evolution. Let's go to this one. Let's see, this one is from. That's crazy. Well, I want to. Yeah, let's start with this one. This is from the book called She Has Her Mother's Laugh. It's a genetic book. I'm going to read it. Combine them with the opposite sex and break apart the links between their genes. But there are other ways for them to break Mendel's law as well. Sometimes individual genes take over heredity for their own evolutionary benefit. These molecular hackers first came to light in the 1920s with the discovery of flies with too many daughters. A Russian biologist named Sergei Gershenson went to a forest to trap a species of fly called Drosophila obscura. When he brought the flies back to the Institute of Experimental Biology in Moscow, he figured out how to keep them alive on a diet of fermented raisins, potatoes, and water. Some of the female flies he trapped were carrying fertilized eggs, which they then laid by the thousands. Gershenson picked some of their offspring to breed new lines he could study for inherited traits. There was something peculiar about two of the lines, Gershenson noticed. Typically, a batch of eggs produced by Drosophila obscura contains an even balance of males and females. But in two of Gershenson's lines, the mothers tended to produce far more daughters than sons. Sometimes they had no sons at all. The ratios were so extreme, Gershenson said, that it seemed impossible to explain them by accidental causes. To find the true cause, Gershenson carried out a series of breeding experiments. The penchant for daughters could be passed down like a simple genetically encoded trait. Eventually, Gershenson figured out that it was determined by a gene on the X chromosome, but he couldn't understand how the gene tilted the balance away from sons and toward daughters. Whatever its particular trait might be, Gershenson realized it had slipped through a loophole in Mendel's law. Flies normally have a 50% chance of becoming male or female because sperm have a 50% chance of acquiring an X or Y chromosome. As a result, a normal gene on the X chromosome will end up in about half of a male fly's offspring. In Gershenson's flies, on the other hand, the math is different. If a male fly carried the mysterious mutation he discovered, most, or even all of his offspring inherited his X chromosome. Few, if any, inherited his Y. Those flies could then pass the daughter-producing genes down to their own offspring. Overall, the odds of flies inheriting the daughter-favoring mutation would be much higher than 50%. As a result, it would become more common in the population. This, Gershenson concluded favors its extension. At first, Gershison's discovery might have seemed like an oddball exception to the rules of heredity, but it didn't take long for scientists to find other cases where genes were fixing Mendel's dice in their own favor. Collectively, these violations can be known as gene drive. Gene drive is so powerful that it can spread a gene like an intergenerational epidemic until it dominates the entire population. Today, the gene drive catalog has many entries, not just in flies, but in plants, fungi, mammals, and perhaps even humans. In some cases, a gene drive spreads itself by encoding a toxin. Sperm cells carrying it make the toxin, which then spread to other sperm. If the sperm die unless they have the gene drive element, which also contains an antidote to the toxin. In other cases, the gene drive waits until male embryos start developing before switching on and killing them. Gene drive can break Mendel's law in females too. When a precursor egg cell develops, it divides into 4 cells. One becomes an egg, while the other 3 become polar bodies. In other words, 3 reproductive dead ends. A given copy of a gene normally has a 50-50 chance of ending up in the egg rather than a polar body. Some genes have evolved the ability to manipulate those odds. They're more likely to end up in the egg, and thus to get passed down to future generations of daughters. With so much evidence for the power of gene drive among other eukaryotes, it stands to reason we might be subject to it as well. But the evidence for cheating on Mendel is still unclear in humans. It's not surprising that it would be hard to study gene drive in our own species. Scientists can breed flies and fungi, inspecting every step of reproduction to catch gene drive in the act. When it comes to humans, geneticists must make the best of uncontrolled history. So yeah. Moving on. Let's see. I think I'm gonna go see if there's some new ones. Try this one. It was random, but. If you need any convincing that William T. Bowman. This one is out of Human Natures. I remember having it. I don't have it anymore, but it's out of a book called Human Natures. Why not learn about Human Natures? So let's just read about this one. Okay, I'm gonna do 25-minute videos so that people don't get bored. But so let's talk for a moment about okay, so let's start. Of the 7 Dreams series. Anthropological reviews, however, have claimed that neither of these studies is definitive. The minor marriages are viewed by the Taiwanese as second-class marriages that could even be humiliating. So as anthropologist Marvin Harris puts it, it is impossible to prove that sexual disinterest, rather than chagrin and disappointment over being treated like second-class citizens, is the source of the couple's infertility. In the kibbutz case, the anthropological counterclaim is that the number of marriages between alumni of the same kibbutz was actually higher than expected. This is one of the reasons why anthropologists seldom resort to genetic explanations of taboos, even though there is widespread avoidance of mating among other animals. In all this confusion, one thing that seems reasonably certain. This is a good example of his. I'm just gonna read it. I don't like it. Okay, so what? In all this confusion, one thing that seems reasonably certain is that incest avoidance did not evolve genetically in human beings, because incest disrupted family structure and was thus unhealthy for society. Such an explanation is probably wrong because it invokes group selection. In this case, the differential reproduction of societies rather than individuals. The special conditions that could permit group selection to be a powerful force seem unlikely to have been present, often among populations of our ancestors. Genetically, then, the occurrence of incest should be influenced by a balance between 2 factors. One factor is the physiological penalties that most animal species pay for inbreeding, which tends to make individuals genetically uniform. Technically, to have identical alleles from the gene at each locus is to be highly homozygous. When that occurs, deleterious alleles that are recessive do not change the phenotype when accompanied by a different dominant allele. Technically, when an individual is heterozygous at a locus, this is complex, are expressed and have a debilitating influence on the phenotype. That is the case, for example, when a child receives 2 recessive alleles at a cystic fibrosis locus. producing a phenotype with that tragic disease. The result is called inbreeding depression because highly homozygous individuals often have reduced viability or reproductive capacity. The other factor influencing the likelihood of incest is that incest may increase the presence of the genes of incestuous individuals in the next generation. If one mates with one's siblings or other close relatives, instead of unrelated individuals and there's little inbreeding depression, the result will be an increase in inclusive fitness, the passing on of genes identical to one's own, as long as those relatives do not otherwise reproduce. Relatives share some identical genes. Unless there is a countervailing level of inbreeding depression, more copies of one's genes can be sent on to the next generation by mating with an otherwise non-reproducing relative and by mating with a stranger. I just want to get through this, but still information. In the absence of the constraint of inbreeding depression, selections generally favor incest concentrated within families. All this, of course, begs the question whether there actually is significant genetic influence on whether or not one mates with relatives. In human beings, inbreeding depression occurs in father-daughter matings and brother-sister matings to a much smaller degree in marriages between cousins, which come in various Asian African societies. Marriages among relatives increase the rate of genetic disorders, and if mortality rates from childhood infectious diseases continue to drop in the rural developing countries, families will have more mature individuals of opposite sexes, and the opportunities for marriage among relatives will increase. That in turn could cause a shift in the disease profile of those countries, with a decline in infectious diseases and an increase in those related to inbreeding, necessitating cultural evolution in the medical care delivery system. Inbreeding depression may have been a fairly substantial problem in relatively small groups of our early ancestors. There's not enough information about it, about the costs of exogamy, mortality reduced for fecundity involved in migration of the group, and so on to know exactly what balances were struck. One question whether incest taboos developed because our ancestors observed the deleterious effects of incest because inbreeding depression and the balance discussed earlier selected for genetic influence on many behavior that caused people to avoid choosing close relatives as partners, as it has in other organisms or both. Evolutionist John Maynard Smith suggested that when symbolic communication, myth-making, cultural transmission became the dominant modes of communication, our ancestors' earlier incest barriers changed into incest taboos. Something like this may indeed have happened. A mathematical model developed by population geneticist Kenneth Aoki and Marcus Feldman examined what would happen if the mating pattern of parents affected that of their offspring. If, for example, the probability of a girl wanting to mate with a brother were a function of whether her parents were brother and sister. It's weird. Aoki and Feldman's gene culture correlation model shows that if there is sufficient inbreeding depression, a purely cultural determination of mate preference may have evolved the parent brother sister mating. In any case, the existence of incest taboos, like the existence of kinship systems, shows that ideas of morality can be related to issues of genetic evolution. We have seen repeatedly how complex some basic questions about behavioral evolution can be, even when the behavior has direct, obvious connections to fitness. The sociobiological approach, one that considers fitness, costs, and benefits, puts some constraints on the kinds of tales that can be woven. But it's still extremely difficult to develop wholly satisfactory answers because of the often overriding influence of cultural evolution, which is poorly understood. Reducing human problems to questions of gene frequency rarely provides a definitive solution for them. At the same time, over the past decades, we have clearly made progress toward understanding many aspects of the extremely complex natures of human beings, and the evolution of sexual behavior is no exception. Hunter-gatherers did a lot more than eat and have sex, and as we will see, unraveling the evolution of phenomena such as violence and religious belief is no less challenging. Okay, basically that. See, this is the other one I was reading. Yeah, I'm gonna read this one. I think. Oh, it's from Faster. I know what this one's from. This is a book called Faster, but I think his name is Gleick. Gleick. And I like this last page that I read about the Faster book because it was talking about. Oh yeah, I'm having a lot of ideas. Okay, this one says it's from Faster, and it's called On Internet Time. I hope I get into some stoicism, some philosophy. Dean Houston is both rueful victim and cheerful perpetrator of the information glut. By 1915, in the fourth decade of commercial telephone service, the American transcontinental system had developed the capacity to handle three simultaneous voice calls. A generation later, AT&T developed a coaxial cable that can handle 480 calls at once. By the 1980s, individual Telstar satellites had enough capacity for nearly 100,000 telephone links, though they were more likely to use the bandwidth for television transmission. Now terabit transmissions coming online, 1 trillion bits per second, are enough for 3 centuries of fat daily newspaper. This is the information age, which does not always mean information in our brains. We sometimes feel that it means information whirling by our ears at light speed, too fast to be absorbed. The American company that promoted the internet hardest in its early days, Sun Microsystems, conducted research in 1997 into how people read on the web and concluded simply they don't. They scan sampling words and phrases. Why? In part because any one page on which the fluttering user happens to have glided momentarily competes for attention with millions more. Jacob Nelson, the Sun scientist who carried out the study, cited a typical complaint by a test user, dismayed to be confronted by actual prose paragraphs of it. If this happened to me at work when I get 70 emails and 50 voicemails a day, that would be the end of it. If it doesn't come right out at me, I'm going to give up on it. Nelson proposed guidelines for catering to such users, guidelines that came to describe more and more of the internet reading experience, highlighted keywords, bulleted lists, frequented subheadings, paragraphs containing exactly one idea, nothing sticky enough to slow the reader's headlong slide. Reading email starts to feel like a forced march through a shadeless landscape. More Sun research found, as Nelson says, that everybody who has email complains about the masses of email they get. Interestingly, the complaints are about equally strong no matter how many messages an individual user gets. In other words, people will tell us, I am so overwhelmed. Can you believe that I get 10 emails per day? With the same tone of voice as somebody complaining of 100 messages or more. My explanation for this phenomenon is that people's expectations for what to do with the mail changes. When they get a little, they treat it as a personal correspondence and consider each message and just reply carefully. When they get a lot, most messages immediately are faded for the delete key. Users are constantly behind on upgrading their behavior on this curve of information neglect, so they constantly feel stressed. No quills to sharpen, no ink to blot, just bits and more bits at light speed. Somehow, these same stressed people find minutes to visit a website, lets them watch in real time what other people are searching for. The search terms flash by, fleeting signposts of information glut, romantic ideas, writing and love and letters, cable reel truck, free clip art, London real estate, conduct disorder. It is as if the New World brain were on display at a science museum and you could peer in and watch the neurons crackling. Technology has opened a direct channel inside. Other stuff pouring in causes congestion, takes up space, reduces productivity, floods the basement, and hyperventilates the attic. That is a sensation anyway, almost universally shared. More than 20,000 distinct sites on the World Wide Web address the issue of information overload and inevitably contribute to the problem. Information overload? Asks an internet banner advertisement for, it turns out, Microsoft pointed devices. The proposed solution is to get moving with an interactive demonstration of scrolling and zooming. Okay, that's about 25 minutes. I saw some Play-Doh. Let me just stop it right here and post it. Thanks, folks.